Hey there, and welcome to the Restoration Living Podcast. My name is James Johnson, and I am excited that you have chosen to spend time with us today. The goal of this podcast is to show that God's heart for each of us is to come back home to Him in order for us to experience a restoration of peace, joy, and growth in our lives. We do this by digging deep into God's Word in order to find timeless truths that we can apply in our lives today. So let's get out our Bibles and take another step down this path of restoration living together.
Hey guys, this is Dr. James back with you again, and I want to apologize for taking so long to get back another episode to you, but we had some technological issues that slowed us down, and we had to get some security reset and all kinds of issues, but we're back with you now. So thank you for joining us for another episode of the Restoration Living Podcast. And I wanted to go back and add to a message we did a while back called Measuring Maturity. And we talked about how the same way we can measure our physical maturity, how we develop things like learning how to walk and get better over time. You know, we took our first steps to walking, to eventually running and doing complex athletic movements, to the way we learn to eat. You know, in the beginning, we're bottle fed and then spoon fed and then hand fed, you know, feeding ourselves with our hands. And eventually we get to sophisticated things like using chopsticks, forks, and knives. And of course, the goal is to eventually learn how to be able to cook and feed ourselves. In the same way that we can measure maturity, I recognize that we can also measure morality. And that's what we're going to discuss today, is this idea of measuring morality. Because one of the issues that we recognize as we go through our world is that, man, there are some hot button topics in our world today. Questions like the issue of abortion. And is it a right for women to be able to choose to terminate their pregnancy, or, as the classical Christian and more conservative Christian worldview would say, that life begins at conception, and to knowingly end a pregnancy, to terminate a pregnancy, is to take a life, which would be tantamount to murder. These political and also moral issues are at the forefront of our day, and as we get ready to enter into a new political season, as of the time of this recording, we are entering into a presidential election season. And a lot of people, especially in the Christian scene, the Christian worldview, are arguing, debating, considering, and even fighting over these moral issues. And so as we look at this idea of morality, I mean, what do we do with issues like the war in the Gaza Strip, the war in Ukraine? Where do we settle on right and wrong when it comes to the United States giving international aid? Where do we settle on whether that's right for war crimes or what constitutes a war crime? And social media, you know, we debate all of these things of what is an overreach of access for these social media platforms to gather our information and sell them. You know, do we really know what we're getting ourselves into when we begin to agree to these terms and notices? All of these things hinge on the issue of morality. And so what we have to recognize is the issues of our world are much more complicated than we like to think so. You know, one of the things that has changed over time, I mean, think about even not too long ago in the 40s and 50s, you know, when I was in the Smithsonian's with our girls, our family took a family vacation to Washington, D.C., and we went to the Smithsonian's. There's a section that talks about whether or not, you know, things are okay anymore. Like, it shows you this whole thing where doctors used to prescribe cigarettes. And there's an article that we were looking at that said, you know, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. And we were talking about how, you know, with our girls, that we used to believe, man, this was okay, that cigarette smoke was actually beneficial and healthy. And of course, before that, we used to focus on things like, is it okay to do bloodletting, or the issue of slavery? So culture focuses on different things over time, but what we have to recognize is that in the Christian worldview, the method may change, but the message stays the same. God may change how he displays and works through history and people to accomplish his purposes, but God does not change. And so God's view of morality does not change either. And this idea really came up in my life just a few months ago, where I have had these discussions before, but it was kind of sitting around this idea of the political election and how our different parties, whether you're Republican, Democratic, Independent, or somewhere in between, views morality in the world differently. And while we were having this conversation, I'm with another soldier in the military. In my uniform as a chaplain, I have the symbol of my faith on my uniform. As a Christian chaplain, I have the cross above the word, the United States Army on one side of my name, on the other, and above my name is the cross. And so she looks at me and she points me and said, "You Christians are the worst. You're the most to blame for so many of these problems because you've created so much division and so much, judgment. Why can't you just let people do what they want to do and quit judging and condemning them for their lifestyles? Who are you to say that that's wrong anyway?" Well, it was a pretty emotionally charged question, emotionally charged set of statements. And as I sat down with her to have this conversation, this young soldier, I wanted to make sure we did things well. And I told her how in my life over time, I have won a lot of arguments, but lost a lot of friends. And I don't want that to happen in this conversation. So I sat down with her and said, okay, let's agree to some things. If we're going to have this conversation, I'd like to establish some ground rules. And so I had 3 things that I asked her if we could do. I asked her, so first, can we be kind to each other? And she took a deep breath and said, yes, I think we can do that. I said, okay, we may disagree, but we can at least agree to be kind. And she said, sure, let's do that. I said, okay, rule number 2 that I like to follow is, can we both agree to have an open mind? That I'm not perfect. I haven't figured all of life out. I'm still learning. I'm still growing. I think I know what I believe. I call myself a confident skeptic. I'm confident in my beliefs and my faith and my ideas, but I'm also open to hear from other people because I'm still learning. I'm still growing. And I asked her, I said, can we both have an open mind? Can we both agree to that? And she was in agreement with me, and so that worked fine. And I said, number 3, what I like to do is I like to find common ground. Can we look for the things we agree on? And she, once again, was okay with that. She said, all right, let's look and see what we agree on. And so I asked her if I could ask her some more clarifying questions to find this common ground, and she allowed me to. And I said, okay, so do you and I agree that human life is precious, that human life is valuable? And she agreed with me. I said, okay, so we're not going to have an Adolf Hitler, Nazi, Germany kind of conversation where some human beings are more valuable than others. And she said, no, all human beings are valuable. I said, great, I agree with you. All human beings are of priceless value. I said, do you believe in right and wrong? And she did, because the vast majority of people do believe in right and wrong. And so we agreed. I said, look at all the common ground we're finding. And the third question I had for her was, do you believe in good and evil? Because right and wrong can hinge on all kinds of things. Right and wrong can hinge on laws and ethics and social norms. But morality transcends all of those. And I asked her, do you believe in good and evil? And she took a couple of seconds to think about it, but she said, yes, I do. And then I asked her, the last question is, what are you using to measure your morality? What system are you operating in that causes you to know what that right and wrong is? What is ethical and appropriate? If you find, money on the ground, do you keep it or turn it in? And I told her of a situation where last Thanksgiving in America, we have the Black Friday holiday. And while we were doing some Black Friday shopping, it was early before the sun had really come out. We were walking through the parking lot, and our oldest daughter reaches down and picks some money up off the ground. And she comes and she brings it to me, and she says, Daddy, look what I found. And we looked at it, and it was $200. Now, my daughter had a choice. She could have taken that money and she could have put it in her pocket and she could have kept it. And I asked her, I said, honey, what do you want to do with this? You found this money. What do you feel? What do you think? What do you believe is the right thing to do? And she thought about it for a minute and she said, Daddy, I would love to keep this money. But what if this is somebody's Christmas money? What if this is some mom or dad or grandparent who wants to buy Christmas presents for their children and they have lost this money? Maybe they were reaching for their keys and things like that. And our oldest daughter, she's 15 now. She was 14 then. And I smiled and I said, baby, I agree with you. I think that's the right thing to do, because she recognized, and I asked her why she felt that way. And she said, because Jesus said we should treat people the way we want to be treated. And if this was my money, especially if it was my money for Christmas presents, I would want somebody to turn it back in. And after that, and of course, there's all kinds of questions. If we turn it in to the store, is somebody ever going to come back and ask for it? Is the store person going to keep it for themselves? That's out of our hands. That's out of our responsibility. We can't control other people. We can only control ourselves. And I told that story to this young soldier that I was talking to, and I said, you see, our daughter had a system of morality she was operating in to let her know what was right and wrong in that situation. I asked her, what was her morality? What was her system based on? And so what we have to understand as we look at this idea of measuring morality is, according to Drs. Elmer, van der Toorn, and Paunoff in The Psychology of Morality, they say that the definition of morality is the right and wrong way to behave, believe, or understand concepts of good and evil. As we've been talking about, it's how we decide these ethical norms of our life, of right and wrong. How do we make decisions? And so another way to say that is the way we measure morality determines how we live in and process reality. You see, if I look at the war in Gaza right now, my morality is going to determine whether or not I think that the actions of the Israelis or the Palestinians are right or wrong. Whose side am I on, or am I on any side at all? What do I believe about violence and warfare? What do I believe about theft and taxation? What do I believe about laws and legal codes? All of these are tied to my system of morality. And so as we go through this scenario, there are tons of different things we have to recognize that are all connected to our worldview. Now, if you've listened to episodes on this podcast, you've heard us talk about the idea of a worldview numerous times. But for the sake of time, I'm going to, in the sake of our conversation, I'm going to rehash those 4 things that we have to create a worldview. Our worldview is literally that. It's how we view the world. It's the windshield that we look through to see the events of life and make sense of reality. To do that, we have to answer 4 questions called the ontological questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Origin asks the question, where did everything come from? Meaning asks the question, what's the purpose of my life? Morality asks the question, who determines what is right and wrong? And destiny asks the question, what happens to me when I die? Now, when I was talking to this young lady, I had to explain to her that in the Christian worldview, we would say that everything came from God. That God created life, the universe, and everything. And that you and I operate and live in the world within the creation of the cosmos that God has made. The purpose of our life comes from God, that God has created us to bring his kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. He is the one who determines morality, because when we die, we are going to interact with eternity, and our actions and our decisions will have impacts on our eternal life, specifically our relationship with God or our rejection of a relationship with God. And so as she and I began to have this discussion, I wanted to show her how our worldview filters down into our values of the things we believe are right and wrong, which filters down into the ethics of how we actually live our life. And so as we discuss this idea of how we measure morality, and she and I were having this discussion, I brought up the fact that every moral system, once you've decided on a worldview, has to measure based off of 5 sets. Now, as an English teacher and a minister, I like for words and things to be either to rhyme or to start with the same letter to help with memory. And so there are 5 M's, 5 things that a system of morality has to have. And as we sat around the coffee table and had a cup of coffee together, this young soldier and I, we discussed these 5 things. And those 5 things are that morality must be mutual, morality must be meaningful, morality must be modern, morality must be measurable, and morality must be moored. And so we're going to talk about all 5 of those things: mutual, meaningful, modern, measurable, and moored. So let's dig into those. I know the M's might make that confusing, but I want everything to kind of be easy to memorize. So let's start with the first one. Morality must be mutual. It has to be something that applies equally to everybody in order for it to be fair, in order for it to be just. And so in an adequate system of morality, it can't be rules for thee but not for me, as the phrase goes. For morality to be equal, I can sit there and say, you know what? I know that the United States came together and the leaders decided that slavery needed to be abolished, but man, I have a factory that I run, and the only way I make money is off of slave labor, and they do all the work and I get all the reward. And so in my system of morality, it may work for you to say slavery is wrong, but for me, I think slavery is right. Well, we've got a conflict there, don't we? Because this value of the human life is not equal. It's not mutual. It's not applying to everyone. And in a system of morality of right and wrong, the same system must function equally for every person. And this is where the postmodern generations, that there have been 3 generations that have come into existence in history after the postmodern era began. We had the millennials, right, the Gen Zers, and now the generation Alpha, which is what our children are part of. And so as they are emerging onto the landscape of history, the vast majority of them, I say the vast majority, 56%, so maybe not the vast majority, but the majority, 56%, do not believe in absolute truth. They believe that truth is subjective to the situation, the person, and what's going on in the world at the time. And whenever I talk with somebody that says that they do not believe in absolute truth, I love to look at them in the eye and say, do you believe that absolutely? Is that an absolute statement that you're making? Or is truth only subjective some of the time? And of course, once they think about it, they usually either laugh or kind of have that aha moment where they're making an absolute statement that there are no absolutes. There are absolutely no absolutes. That's a self-defeating statement. It's like saying I always lie. Well, if I always lie, then that statement I just told is a lie, which means I don't always lie. It's a self-defeating argument, and it falls apart. And so we have to recognize that truth by nature is exclusive. It is either true or false. Now, there may be different categories and qualifications for something, but if I were to say it is raining outside, you and I could walk outside and test that against reality. Is there precipitation falling from the sky that we would classify as rain? Now, the reason I say you can use qualifiers is you can say, is it mist? Is it sleet? Is it fog? Well, no, none of those are rain. Rain is when, there's a certain amount of water falling from the sky in, landing on the ground. And so we can hold our hands out and say, do we feel water falling from the sky and hitting our hands? No, we don't. It's not raining. We can test that. If I were to have a friend come up and tell us that she was pregnant, well, we could test that. Go get a pregnancy test and let's see. Go do blood work and do a pregnancy test to see, is she pregnant or is she not? We can test it. If I say, oh, the law of gravity doesn't apply to me, I can jump in the air and float. We can test it. You see how that works? Truth by nature is exclusive and we can test it. And so morality must be mutual. It has to apply to everyone. But morality must also be meaningful. It has to apply to us in our life. It has to be centered on things that are important. Now, in this particular episode, we're not going to talk about the issue of abortion, but the reason why morality matters is abortion is a meaningful topic. If human life begins at the moment of conception, that means that single-celled embryo implanted in the mother's womb is just as much a human being as somebody that has trillions of cells outside of the womb. And location, development, maturity, all those things do not change the value of that human life. And so the way we view morality determines all of these things. That's a meaningful question. When does human life begin? The idea of morality applies. Is it right to take a human life when you have other choices? I mean, warfare, that's an issue of morality. Is war justified sometimes, or is war never justified? And so just war theory that discusses this idea of morality, that's meaningful in this world today. As a military man, as a soldier, I have to wrestle with that. Is there ever a time where war is justified and violence is justifiable? That's meaningful. So we have to recognize that for a system of morality to work, it must be meaningful. And here's the next one. Morality must be modern. It has to be something that applies to you and me today. If I'm discussing morality and I'm going back and I'm talking about the way the Romans used to treat non-citizens, well, we can talk about that, but I'm going to be real with you. The Roman Empire's laws are nice to study, but they don't impact my life today. I need to talk about morality today with things like artificial intelligence, things like privacy overreach. When we have all of these smart devices and speakers in our homes, is the government listening? Are other people listening? Are the businesses that own them listening and collecting my data in order to use it, to make more money off me? Is that morally right? Is that ethically appropriate? That's modern. And so there are certain things that may have been important thousands of years ago, but they don't apply to you and me today. When we talk about issues of morality, we have to discuss the things that matter to us today in our current lives. Otherwise, it's not really that important. All right, here's where we get to the harder ones. So far, this young lady had agreed with me about the first three things. And then I got to the fourth one. So she agreed with me that morality must be mutual, it must be meaningful, and it must be modern. But here's the fourth one. Morality must be measurable. And I asked her, I said, how are you measuring your morality? Because she kind of let me, roll the conversation for a little while. And then I asked her, because she wanted to know how Christians could be so condescending and condemning and judgmental against people who want to live alternate lifestyles that are not the norm. Who are we to say that that's wrong and to judge and condemn them for that? And so I asked her, I said, now at this point, we're probably going to start diverging. I said, so how are you measuring your morality? And she said, I don't know. So I asked her a question. I said, in this room that we're in, how do you feel? What do you think the measurements are? And she said, well, I think maybe it's a 20 by 30. I said, well, what if I thought it was a 21 by 28? Oh, what are we going based off of? Our feelings. And you see, feelings are wonderful things. They give us information, but they don't match a certain standard. Because what happens when your feelings and my feelings disagree? Hitler felt like it was perfectly okay to commit the genocide of the Jewish people because he believed in Darwinian evolution, the survival of the fittest, and that he had to eliminate the weaker species to make room for the stronger, the Aryan race to come about. As long as there were weaker races for people to intermingle with, the Aryan race was never going to come to fruition. And I asked her about that. And I said, what's the difference? And so she came to the point after a little bit of thinking where she recognized that the problem with feelings is feelings can change and feelings can lie. There have been many times where I felt the direction I was going in was right and I was actually wrong. I told her a story where I got on the interstate when I was a young college student, going on the interstate to go back home and visit my family one weekend. And I was driving by feeling, not using a map. And I got on the interstate and everything felt right, everything looked right, everything seemed right, but it should have only taken me an hour to get home. And about an hour and a half later, and I wasn't home, I realized that despite my feelings, I was going the wrong direction. I didn't have a set standard that was measurable until I looked at the signs and it said that I was going west when I was supposed to be going east. And I told her, I said, as long as you and I are using our feelings, that's not a set measurement. You see, we need something that is a standard. I said, how could we measure this room? She said, well, we'll get the measuring tape out and we'll measure in feet and inches. In the United States of America, that's how we would measure that. And we have a set standard. We can measure this room with feet and inches. And if you're listening in a different country, maybe you would use the meter, right, or the centimeter. But there's still, it has to be measurable. We have to be able to say if something is right or something is wrong. And that's what we have to be able to do. And so there are different ways to measure it. So feelings are one way, but they don't work very well. What about laws? And I asked her, what about laws? Laws are ways to measure morality. If the speed limit says it's 70, then breaking the speed limit when I'm due 75, that is wrong. And she smiled because, we laughed and you kind of released some of the tension in the fact that this is, something that most people do. Most people go over the speed limit. But I said, what about a law that says that stealing is wrong or that theft is wrong? And she would say, well, yeah, laws are helpful. I said, do you know it used to be legal to have slaves in America? Do you know in Germany under the Nazis, what they did to the Jews and many other people, right? They killed millions of people, and legally that was okay. Under the German law, that was fine. I said, there are different nations with different laws. So are laws a good way to measure morality? And she said, no, that doesn't work either. I said, so feelings don't work? Laws don't work? What about culture? In some cultures, we say love your neighbor. In other cultures, they say eat your neighbor. In some cultures, like the United States of America, we have laws about the age that a person has to be to give consent to a sexual relationship. In other countries, there are no laws on that. And young children can be, brought into sexual relationships with adults. And in that country, it's legal. It's culturally acceptable. People feel like it's right. And when I said that to her, her face bunched up, and I said, you see, you're recognizing that the feelings, culture, and laws don't work. You need something greater. And this leads us to the last one. Not only does morality have to be mutual, it has to be meaningful, it has to be modern, it has to be measurable, it also has to be moored. To moor something means to anchor it, to hold it in place. And I asked her about compasses. What do compasses do? She said, well, they point north. I said, that's right. So if we get lost in the woods and I go based off my feelings, I can get lost. But I need a compass that tells me direction. I knew I was going the wrong way on the interstate because of the direction. It told me I was going west when I was supposed to be going east. Well, how do I know where west and east are? Well, I have to know what direction north is. The compass shows me. And the reason why a compass works is because it has a fixed point of reference. And I asked her, what would happen if that fixed point of reference no longer mattered? What if we no longer had a true north to follow? Would the compass work? And she said, no, the compass wouldn't work. And I compared a standard compass that points north to a compass in a popular movie. If you've ever seen the Disney movie Pirates of the Caribbean, there's a character portrayed by Johnny Depp called Captain Jack Sparrow. And he has a compass in the movie, and it's a magical compass that points towards the direction of the thing he wants the most. And as the movies go through, the compass, by most people, they think it's broken because it doesn't point north. But he helps them see it points to the thing they want the most. And at the end of the movies, the compass fails him because he no longer knows what he wants most. You see, the point of a compass like that is it's going to fail because it's based off our feelings and our desires. We need a fixed point of reference for a moral compass to work. And I asked her, what's your fixed point of reference? Feelings don't work. Culture doesn't work because it changes. Laws don't work because they change. All three of those things can change. I said, you see, in the Christian worldview, I may not always like it, but God's view of morality is fixed and it does not change. And it began to dawn on her. I said, now you don't have to agree with me when I look at a certain person's lifestyle and I make a judgment and I say, that's not God's best for their life. I said, now I'm not condemning them and saying that they are less valuable, because we started off our conversation on the premise that all human beings are valuable. I said, but what we can do is we can recognize that at least in the Christian worldview, I have a fixed point of reference. I said, but your compass just swirls and swirls around because you don't have a true north. Your compass does not have a north to point to. And so it's constantly shifting and changing. Now, as we finished that conversation, she and I didn't agree. She didn't become a Christian. She didn't bow her knee to Jesus, and she didn't become a Bible-believing Christian. But what she did recognize was that at least, even if we disagreed, that my system of morality, it worked. It met all 5 areas of the measuring that we do. So how do we measure morality? How do we know if our system of morality works? Well, it has to be based on those 5 things. It has to be mutual. It has to apply to everybody. It has to be meaningful. It has to deal with the issues that we're facing in our lives today, not in the past or the future, but here in the present. It has to be modern. It has to apply to the ethical and cultural dilemmas that we face. It has to be measurable. It has to be something that I can apply to different situations with the same standard. Feet and inches work in all kinds of things. How tall am I? How far do I have to travel? How many feet are in a mile? Like all these things, feet and inches work to measure all kinds of things. And lastly, it has to be moored. It has to be anchored. And you see, that's where our culture's morality fails in the greatest way. It's anchored either in feelings, in culture, or in laws, and all 3 of those things can change. In order for a compass to work, it has to have a true north. In the Christian worldview, our true north is God and the Bible, properly interpreted using good hermeneutical tools. The reason why the church is struggling in the United States right now is we have began to make everything unanchored from the Bible. We've begun to interpret the Bible how we see fit, the reader response theory, all these different things that have corrupted the classical teachings of the Christian faith. And so as you and I get ready to close, I want to remind you of the phrase that we have used multiple times, which is that feelings must be balanced with reality to lead us to truth. You see, when I view my morality based only off my feelings, that's unbalanced. We should look at our feelings. But even when I don't like something, I have to recognize that my system of morality has to be based off the Bible. I would love to sit down and say, do what makes you happy. As long as you're not hurting anybody. Well, here's the problem. Doing what makes me happy might hurt people. It might even hurt myself. God's way is what ultimately leads to our best. So as we look at morality one more time, how do we measure it? It has to have 5 things. How do we know if our system of morality actually works? It must be mutual. It must be meaningful. It must be modern. It must be measurable. And it has to be moored. Well, I pray in this upcoming season, and when you have your coffee table conversations, that like I was able to do with this young soldier and I, we didn't agree at the end, but she at least came to my perspective and she gave me insight into her perspective. We had a cup of coffee. We had a great conversation. And at the end of the day, we built a relationship that was based on mutual respect. And so that's what you and I can do during this season and every season, whether it's an election season or not, whether politics are on the forefront of our minds or whether it's not a big deal. We can always focus on being kind, and we can have these discussions about how do we measure morality. It has to have those 5 things. So I pray that blesses you. I pray that helps you. And thank you again for joining us. If you like what you're listening to, I don't make any money off of this. There's no ads or anything like that. This is purely a ministry from my own heart. But I would love for you to subscribe, to follow along with us as we continue down this journey of restoration living together. So until next time, be blessed.
Thank you for joining us for this episode. We pray that God uses it to inform your mind, improve your life, and ignite your heart with a renewed passion to impact others for the kingdom of God. And be sure to subscribe to this podcast so that you can continue along with us on this journey of restoration living.